welcome everybody. I am David Neufeld, the Director of Inclusion at Jewish Learning Works, and today we are here to talk about autism. This is an Autism 201 section. It's the first in a three-part series meant for people that have some experience and exposure to a few of these diagnoses that we see in our lives as educators. This one is autism, and there are two more coming up. I think almost everybody who's on this particular call has signed up for the other two as well. There'll be one on ADHD, and then another one later on sensory processing challenges. And that's that. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth a little bit between PowerPoint and us talking. I do want to just say at the outset, if you have questions, concerns as we go, even if the PowerPoint is up, please feel free to shout out. I'm not the kind of presenter who insists that everybody hold their questions till the end. I will stop you for a couple of reasons only. Number one, if it's getting a little too specific, at least until the end when we will hopefully have time for those specific questions, given this is a 201 section. And number two, if we're about to get to it, I'll say it's a great question, hold on to that thought for a minute, we're about to get to it. Other than that, please, I like these things to be conversational as much as possible. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you all, and we will get going. 1 second. All right. Hopefully everybody can see this. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Yeah? All right, good. Lots of thumbs up. This is the last slide, though. That's not going to help you. Let's go to the first slide. All right, here we go. So as I said, today we are talking about Autism 201. I always like to start these things with just a little sort of breakdown agenda of what it is that we're going to cover. So even though this is a 201 session, I do realize that, of course, people have different experiences and levels of experience with autism. So we'll do a really quick review of autism in general. Nothing as lengthy as I've done in my other intro sessions, but it will at least give you sort of a review and maybe some stuff that you haven't thought about before. There's a little bit of a section, because we're at 201, I thought it might be interesting to talk for a few minutes, not long, about diagnostic blind spots and language, things that sort of come up when we're dealing with kids who might not get diagnosed, or how do we talk about it? What's the word that we use? A lot of people ask those kinds of questions. We'll then do sort of a little overview of different kinds of interventions and approaches that are out there, really two main kinds, a play-based kind and a behavioral kind. And all of that I'm hoping will be relatively quick, so that we can spend most of our time in the last two sections, which are going to be about kind of doing some scenarios, some case studies. One is a whole group, so we can get ourselves warmed up, and then I'll break you up into small groups, kind of based on the where in the community you fit, and we will have some time to work on some scenarios together and then come back to report. And at the end, hopefully there'll be some time for, if you do have specific concerns that are coming up about kids. For the purposes of this, since we're recording, let's not use any names or identifying information, but certainly if there are challenges that are coming up that you want to talk about, we can do that in that section. Okay, so before we do that, I'd just like to take a minute for us all to kind of connect with each other. And we're going to do this in two ways. First, we're going to connect just like briefly for a second with ourselves. Webinars, virtual workshops like this are a little bit tricky. When we're on our computers, we're very likely to be multitasking, doing other things. An email comes in, a reminder if something else comes in, we have to edit this document, whatever. And so I know that when people come to these, our levels of attention and presence vary day to day, moment to moment, in a way that doesn't exactly happen when we're actually in person. And so I just want to take a moment for everyone to just take a breath and think about, on a scale of 1 to, instead of 10, let's do 7. On a scale of 1 to 7, how kind of present here in this moment with us in this session are you right now? From 1 being, I am barely here, I'm kind of half listening while I'm doing 3 other things. I run a religious school and people are calling me, like, this is a terrible time for me, but I'm gonna do my best, right? That's number 1, that's 1. All the way up to 7, which is that I am totally here, present, and 100% of my attention is here. It's not something we're going to share. It's just something for you to think about for yourselves. So let's take just a couple big breaths together. Ready? 1, 2, 3, in. And out. One more. And one last. Thank you. So I like to start, many of you may have seen this quote before, but I sometimes like to start these things with just a little brief, it's not even a text study really. It's just more like we put up a quote here and see if anybody has any responses. Oops, I didn't mean to go back, sorry. Somebody like to read this to us? Anyone?
I'll read.
Go ahead.
A human being mints many coins from the same mold, and they are all identical. But the Holy One, blessed be God, strikes us all from the mold of the first human, and each one of us is unique.
Great. So what do you notice about this, or what does this bring up for you? What do you think of when you see a quote like this? How many have seen this before, first of all? Several of us, yeah. It's a pretty common one that we use when we talk about inclusion. So what is this telling us? Bob. And again, if you raise your hand, I may or may not see you. Bob, you happen to be on my screen now, so I saw you.
Oh yeah, no, I've seen the quote before.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think it's as far as the basically we're all cut from the same mold, but we're all individuals also. We're all made in the presence of the Almighty, but we still have our own identities, our own thoughts, and our own idiosyncrasies, I guess.
Absolutely. And some of our kids on the spectrum have idiosyncrasies that are really idiosyncratic and that we're not used to seeing in most kids. So I think it bears remembering that, this is a good thing that there's so much difference in the world. Anybody else have a response to that? Anything that it brings up for them?
I would say that I guess in all our differences, it's important to remember the commonality that we have, that we're all kind of from the same source and have some basic stuff in common, and maybe more in common than differences.
I think usually that's the case. I mean, this is especially when we talk about autism or really disabilities in general, right? It's easy to forget that people with disabilities are also people, right, who have the same needs and wants and desires and things that they hope for as everybody, including people with autism, right? One of the things that we see with kids with autism a lot is they're not especially effective at social interaction, right? And sometimes might be more isolated. And it's very easy to think, oh, they don't care about other people. They just want to be by themselves. Usually that's not the case, right? They're human beings. They want to connect like anybody wants to connect, but sometimes it's a matter of not knowing how. And I think that's another benefit of the spectrum thing that a couple of people talked about before this session started, about how everything is on the spectrum. And we all, at a given day might feel more or less social, right? Or more or less rigid or more or less sensitive, right? At a given day, at a given moment, right? But yeah, more alike than we are different, I think is critical to remember. Any other thoughts? Okay. So here's our little brief kind of review of autism. So this is probably not gonna be new information for anybody who is here, but what is autism, or what is autism spectrum disorder? You see ASD up here, that's what it stands for, is autism spectrum disorder. There used to be many different diagnoses. There was one called Asperger's syndrome, there was one called Rett syndrome, there was one called pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. As diagnostic categories, they do not exist anymore. They've all been kind of rolled into this one concept of autism spectrum disorder. And that's what this is trying to capture here. So ACASD, that's what it is. Complex neurobiological disorder, which can affect many parts of a person's life, right? It affects a lot of areas of functioning, more than something like, say, dyslexia, which is primarily about written language and how you process that, and things like that. So the latest statistics, 1 in 59 children currently are diagnosed with autism. That's gone up a lot. When I first started this job almost 10 years ago, I think it was like somewhere in the 80s or 90s, something like that. So it's increased quite a bit in not that long of a time. So now that it's all been under one diagnosis, when you get the diagnosis of ASD, it comes with a severity scale from 1 to 3. By the way, I will send these slides to all of you after the session is done, so don't feel like you have to write all of this down. So write your own notes if you want to, but I will send this out to you. Those of you who are here live and not just watching online, if you're online, sorry, I can't send them to you anymore. However, so it gets diagnosed with a severity scale from 1 to 3. So 1 is needing not very much support, needing very little support. 2 is needing more support, and 3 is needing substantial support. So it's kind of what people used to think about as high functioning, low functioning, severely impacted, less severely impacted. It's more about what kind of support do you need. And then it also gets diagnosed with or without a language impairment and with or without a cognitive or intellectual impairment, right? So if you had a kid that used to be diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, now which is one where you have essentially normal intellectual and language development, but some social challenges, some sensory challenges, some other kinds of challenges, you might get ASD level 1, not needing very much support, without language or cognitive impairment. So that's the language that you'll see if you ever happen to look at a kid's IEP or a note from a doctor or something. It does occur in all racial, ethnic, and social groups. However, more white children are identified than Black or Latinx children. It's not a huge difference. It used to be bigger. The gap is now narrowing. But we do see it get diagnosed more frequently among white families. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. But that's just an interesting kind of thing, but it does exist everywhere. And in Jews, just like in Christians or Muslims, across religions, across cultures, it exists. So it's not so unusual. It is depending on what you read, it's 3 to 4 times more likely to affect boys than girls, or at least maybe more appropriate to say 3 or 4 times more likely to be recognized and diagnosed in boys than in girls. So if you think of the kids in your life who have had autism, chances are most of them are boys. Chances are some of them are also girls. And there is a lot of literature, which we'll talk about briefly pretty soon, about why that is and why it is that we actually think girls are underrepresented with this diagnosis, and that the gap is less big than it used to be. But for the moment, it is 3 to 4 times more likely to affect boys than girls. Yes.
You said that it's gone up. Do you think that's because more girls are being noticed now than before? Because we were just talking about that before the seminar, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think the reasons for why it's gone up, there's a lot of debate about this and why it is. We do pretty much, a big chunk of it we do think is that the definition has been, broadened. It is the spectrum disorder, and there's a lot more awareness about it. So kids who, when some of us were growing up, might have just been thought of as like weird or quirky kids, unusual kids in some way, are now getting diagnosed with this, where they didn't before. However, the increase in kind of recognition and and identification is not enough to explain why it's gone up so much. So we also think there is some kind of environmental factor. We're not sure what that is. There's a lot of research being done on that, but it is primarily genetic. So it does run in families. So it's one of those things where, like, the more prevalent it is, the more prevalent it's going to continue to be, because it is, have a really large genetic component, as well as some environmental things. But I do think a pretty big chunk of it is better recognition and the fact that more kids are coming under that umbrella. But it's not enough to explain all of it. So there's a lot of research. The 2 biggest areas of research that I hear about mostly are early detection, like how soon can we figure this out in a kid's life, and how, and what causes it. All right. So there's a lot of research dollars going towards those 2 questions. So we don't totally know. But more girls now getting diagnosed probably has something to do with it, yes, because that would be part of the increased recognition. So thank you for the question. Okay, so to keep on going a little bit. So when we think about autism, the sort of traditional way of looking at it is this: there's a triad of impairments. Depending on where you fall on sort of like wanting to use the right words, impairments might feel like too strong of a word for you. We can also say challenges, right? There are 3 main areas: socialization, communication, and imagination. So socialization is anything where a kid struggles with reciprocal, meaning back and forth, social interaction. So that has to do with reading social cues, with knowing how to enter play, knowing how to ask a friend to play in ways besides hitting them or biting them or staring at them or whatever else kids might do. All of those things are a part of that first bullet point. Communication is another one that we see. Communication in many forms. We have a lot of kids with autism, especially in the sort of levels 2 and 3, who are not very verbal or totally nonverbal. It's not the case for the number 1, like, kind of Asperger's type kids, but we do see a lot of language delays in autism, which is not compensated for, meaning speech not compensated for by gesture or something like that. So we see a lot of that. We also see kids that speak in sometimes unusual idiosyncratic ways. Sometimes you might have heard the term echolalia. You might have heard it from me, right? Echolalia is, you hear the first part of that is echo, right? It's echoing things that you hear in your life, saying the same things in the same way, or repeating scraps of a script from a movie or a TV show or a book that you love. We see that in kids with autism sometimes. We see kids who ask for the same thing in the same way all the time. I've talked in these sessions about a kid I used to work with who somewhere along the line learned that how you ask for something is, can I have some X, please? So every time he wanted something, he would say, can I have some milk, please? Can I have some juice, please? Can I have some eggs, please? Can I have some blanket, please? In that same way, that same intonation every time, right? So we see some of that. It's usually an artifact of like intense behavioral training where you've learned somehow by reinforcement that that's how you ask for things. But so we see that. And then also communication and socialization are pretty intimately connected, as you can imagine, right? We as human beings tend to communicate largely through language, whether it's with our voices or with signs, or written or something else. So when you struggle with that, it can be harder to socialize and it can make things a little bit trickier. Imagination is the third one. Restrictive, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. That's kind of clinical, kind of technical. Basically what it means is narrow range of interests and liking to do the same thing a lot of the time. We tend to see in kids with autism less pretend play than we see in kids typically developing, or what we might call neurotypical kids. It develops later, pretend play does, and we see some of that, and this kind of need for sameness and ritual and routine. And a lot of that is put in kind of this imagination bucket. So those are kind of the three main areas. Sensory challenges are also often present, not always, but often, and there's a whole other talk about sensory challenges coming, so we're not going to go into that too much now, but that's pretty common. As we were just talking about, based on your question, Bob, the cause of autism is unknown, but that should say is likely a combination of genetics and environmental factors, but not vaccines, right? I look forward to the day where I do not have to say that anymore, but I still have to continue to say that. Vaccines have nothing to do with this. I don't think anybody on this call thinks that, but there are lots of people who do, especially depending on in the Bay Area, right? There are a lot of people who don't do vaccines, and this is a big part of the reason, and it causes all kinds of problems. That's a little soapbox that I can get on another time and talk about with you. But we know not vaccines. Any questions on any of that before we move on to the blind spots? Barbara.
I'm interested in just some ways to talk to people who have that high anxiety about vaccines at some point, if not in this workshop, in a future one, because people do get really worked up about it.
They do.
It can be hard to speak in a way that's can move forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. You know, I mean, for me, it always comes back to the research. I mean, there are so many studies. I mean, I just recently saw, there was one that came out a few months ago, which is like one of my favorite all-time headlines, you know, which was like, yet another gigantic, well-run study proves that there is absolutely no connection between vaccines and autism, right? I mean, there is just study after study after study. Right. Also, you know, people may or may not know that the person that was responsible for creating this whole story that vaccines had to do with it, Timothy Wakefield, that study was totally debunked. It was fraudulent. His medical license was revoked, right? And yet that still persists. You know, so it's when people are making an emotional argument, it's hard to give them a rational response because they're not really wanting to hear that. You know, for me, it comes down to what does the research show? Or if nothing else, if you're worried about it, maybe instead of not vaccinating at all, there are definitely alternative schedules where you're doing less of it, right? And like where the kid is still going to be fine. I mean, we have seen so many increases in cases of measles around the country, especially in those areas, and it's causing real problems, you know, for everybody. And so that's the thing that's really hard to change people's minds on. There's a great book about it. It's a little old at this point. There may be something newer, but I really enjoyed it. It was called Autism's False Prophets. And that has a really great, it starts with Wakefield and it pretty much goes through everything. I want to say it came out in maybe the like early to mid 2000s, like, you know, somewhere in 2004 to 2007, somewhere in there. But it's a great book. So that's one to look at. But that's tough, you know, but I think if people are scared, I think we just tell them, look, I understand that you're scared. It can be scary to like stick your kid with a bunch of needles and put a bunch of stuff in their system and you're not sure how they can respond, how they're going to respond. So maybe consider alternative. But if you don't do it, you're exposing not only your child, but everybody else to diseases that we don't need to get. And it's hard. but that's a tough conversation to have. If you want to talk a little more offline about that, I'm happy to chat with you about it, because it's a thing. Thank you for the question. Anything else? All right. So diagnostic blind spots. This is something that is just recently kind of more interest to me. I haven't gone over it in the earlier kind of more introductory ones, but I already kind of mentioned them. They're gender and race. So I just kind of want to point out, because it's just good to know as educators, when you're seeing kids who have some of these behaviors without the diagnosis, there might be reasons, for that are not having to do with what they're actually doing or how they're actually behaving. So why do we have a diagnostic blind spot for gender? Well, a big reason is the statistic that's really cited, that autism is 4 times more likely to be diagnosed in boys than in girls. It's most often cited as it's cited as fact often, right? I myself have cited it many times, and it's only in recent years that I've started to get a look at some of the research showing that actually the actual incidence of it, meaning not how much it's diagnosed, but how much it actually exists, is a lot less than that in indifference. Recent studies have shown, like I said there, that it's closer to 3 to 1, right? So that's a big reason. We have this in our brains that autism really affects boys, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But that's one of the big ones, and there are some reasons for it, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Race is the other big one. So as I mentioned before, more white children are identified than Black or Latinx children, but that gap is narrowing. Right? I think it's down to white children. It's something like 1.2 times more likely to get diagnosed than Black, or 1.1 times more diagnosed than Black children, and 1.2 more likely to be diagnosed in Latinx children. And so those are the 2 big ones. So what are the reasons for that? Well, for gender, right, as we just said, that statistic is often reported as fact, and it makes people think that autism is a boy's disability, right? We all have this in our heads from years of being told, right? That. Problem is, there are several problems. When there are fewer identified girls, it can be a little bit of a vicious cycle, right? Fewer identified girls means fewer female research subjects. And when I say identified girls, I mean people who self-identify as girls, right? People who identify as girls. You have less, it's a smaller research pool. And it's more expensive to try and find them, because you can't find them through the conventional ways, because those are all targeted to finding boys, right? And there are fewer of them that we know about, so there's a smaller pool to draw from, which then leads to the cycle where we don't know as much about how it looks in girls as we do in boys. A lot of studies have many more boys than girls in them. One of the big movements that people are trying to get going in new research is to, when you're doing a study on autism, to really do half and half. 50% identify girls, 50% identify boys, so that we can really get a better look at what the differences are. So that's one reason for it. When we only look for boys, there are a lot of girls we don't notice, right? This is a thing that was said to me by Ruti Reagan, who is a rabbi with autism herself, and she works for Matan in New York City, does a lot of wonderful webinars. If you haven't seen them, you should check them out. matankids.org is their website, and she's got 10 or something online there that are wonderful, each one better than the next. And that's the thing that she says. When we only look for boys, there are a lot of girls that we don't notice, right? And then related to that is this idea, there's these ideas of masking and overlooking. I don't know if anybody has heard of this term before, but masking is the idea that girls, people who identify as girls, are much more likely to mask their symptoms, right? There are a whole lot of societal, cultural reasons that it is less okay for girls to not connect with other people, for girls girls are expected to be a little bit more social, be a little bit more emotionally oriented, things like that. Even now, right? We know it's not true, but that's what they're told, right? Is that, we hear about it when we talk about even the way that boys and girls fight with each other. It's like boys, it's always about, physical and hurting and wrestling, and girls, it's more like psychological warfare, right? That's what people used to talk about. I mean, and some of it's true. I mean, I see it in my own daughter, with her 3rd grade friends, there's a lot of drama, right? But there's drama with boys too. But so girls are taught from a very young age to mask those symptoms because they're not acceptable, right? For boys, it's a little bit easier to get away with being less in touch with emotions because we don't expect it, right? It's a larger problem. It's the one that we're not going to solve today, right? But it's a thing that happens. So a lot of girls either explicitly or implicitly have learned over the years to sort of mask that part of themselves and kind of put on a show, right? Because that's what's accepted. And you want to feel accepted, right? Is that a hand?
Yeah. I just like we were commenting just before this, and I'm glad we touched on this because Rachel brought up a good point too. Also, what you're saying now is also girls have also been kind of taught not to make eye contact and certain things of that nature, which falls, under what we're talking about. I just wanted to bring that up.
Exactly.
That was very interesting because
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even, I didn't think of it till she mentioned it.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And then overlooking is, so masking is sort of the internal, people doing that themselves. Overlooking is that we don't notice it, right? And again, I think it is related still to this idea that it's all boys. There is this old, unsubstantiated idea that autism brains are like intensely boy brains, right? Like more analytical and more focused on things even than your typical boy brain, right? So to grossly like overgeneralize, we expect girls to be interested in things that are girl coded, right? Things like playing with dolls, things like playing family, things like having tea parties, stuff like that. We don't expect boys to be interested in those things that are girl coded, right? So when we see, so then if girls are interested in things that are boy coded, like engineering type stuff, building, maybe we notice it more. But if they're girls who have autism who are interested in girl coded things, right? They have autism, but they still like to play family and dress up and dolls and all that stuff, we don't notice it, right? Because it's like, oh, that's just what they do, right? Whereas when we see a girl doing something that's more traditionally thought of as a boy activity, right? Then we think, oh, what's going on there, right? So that's another reason. So it just gets overlooked, right? We don't expect it because they're like, oh, she's just, she's hanging out with her friends, and we don't know she's masking, right? And we don't know that, yeah, she's interested in that stuff, but also she's autistic, right? And we kind of overlook it. So there's a lot of reasons for that. Ruti has a great whole webinar about girls called It's a Girl Thing that goes a lot more deeply into this. Barbara, I saw your hand there.
Oh, just is overlooking also part of the challenge parents face with coming to terms with, hey, my kid's my kid versus do they quote need services? Are they getting kicked out of school? Is that part of it? Overlooking also? Is that something else?
I think it's both, right? I mean, I think it can be. I think parents also can overlook things in their own kids because they know them so well. They know what's underneath. And so, with your own child, you might know that even though they're not being social, they really are interested. Or you think, oh, I was just like that when I was a kid. They're just like me, right? Whereas somebody who comes in from the outside, a clinician, someone like that might look at that, compare it to other kids of that age and say, wait, something's a little bit unusual here, right? And so that's a different kind of overlooking, right? I do think that you probably see parents who are less concerned, for those same reasons, right? I mean, parents are humans who live in this culture too, right? And have been kind of acculturated the same way that the rest of us have, right? So, it's one of those things that does come up. But I do think, a lot of educators have told me that parents are in denial, or things like that. I have very rarely seen parents that are fully in denial. I think more likely parents are scared. I think parents are ashamed. I think parents are worried. I think parents are anxious. And that leads them to not tell you what's going on or to not get things checked out because they're worried about what that's going to mean for them and their kid, right? And they may or may not be aware of that, but I've heard so many people say, oh, this mom is just totally in denial about her kid. But it's like, I very rarely have found that to be the case. I think we need to give parents more credit than that. But I do think it is possible to overlook things in your own child that somebody else might notice right away. Because I often say this in trainings with educators, educators are experts on all children, at least children of the age that they are accustomed to working with. Parents are experts on their child for sure, right? They may be also experts on most children of that age, but really they're the expert on their child and you're the experts on children in general and development in general, maybe more than a parent might be. So for us who come in with a different lens, it's easier to see how this boy, this girl looks a little bit different than all the other kids in the class, right? Where a parent might not notice that. A, they're not there. B, they've seen their kid be social in places where they're very comfortable, right? So anyway, that's that. Does that answer your question? Okay. So anything else about gender before I move on to race? I know these are big issues. So like I said, we're not going to solve it today. I just like to put it out there. So for race, so there's a lot of reasons that we see barriers to diagnoses in races that are not white. There's stigma. right? In some cultures, still stigma around mental illness of any kind, or having a kid that needs help. Not to say that we don't have that in the white community as well, certainly, but I think there is, in some places there are stigma. There's a lack of access to healthcare services for a lot of reasons, right? People who aren't citizens, people who have low income, right? That makes it a lot harder to access services. Having your primary language not be English is also really challenging. Trying to navigate a diagnostic system, a service system, when English is not your first language, and if you are a member of a race or ethnicity that is less likely to be taken seriously, or has less kind of, people are less likely to take what you have to say seriously or think about you, right? It can really be a big barrier to diagnosis. And I think that's a big part of the reason. I suspect that there's not actually a difference between races and how many kids do have it. It's more about how many kids get identified that way. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but because it's a much more complex issue than we're making it here, but these are barriers. And we do see that in the diagnostic numbers. And the problem with that, and another one, is that we have a lot of misattributions of behavior. We see this a lot in Black children. There's research to back this up. I've also heard this anecdotally. When kids are behaving in certain ways in class, if they are white, it is more likely that somebody is going to think, oh, that kid has autism, or oh, that kid has something that we need to look at. If they are Black and misbehaving, it's more likely that it's going to be treated as a behavior problem, which is a sad but true fact in society now, right? And so I think that we, and not just now, it has been, but we give white kids, more economically advantaged families, much more benefit of the doubt when it comes to those kinds of behaviors. It's almost like people kind of expect those bad behaviors from some kids, and then they're less likely to look beyond the color of the skin and see what's actually going on, right? And we as educators always have to keep in mind our own unconscious biases and the things that we think about, right? And we have to remember that all the time, even in the Jewish community, right? Which is also diverse with all different kinds of people, but also less diverse than like the public school. We have to be aware of that. So that happens a lot. And the issue with it, of course, beyond just these kids kind of not being recognized for who they are, which is the biggest issue, and it re-solidifying assumptions that have existed wrongly for too long, is that it really affects access to services, right? I mean, people need help. And if they're not getting identified, they're not going to get it. There are a lot of different opinions about diagnosis. Some parents really like it. Some parents really hate it. I've said on these before, I think diagnosis is great for two reasons. Number one, it gets you access to services. That's the biggest, right? Parents can get support, right? Family or schools can get support. And number two, it gives us an idea of the tools that we might use for a kid. Beyond that, it doesn't matter. A kid is a kid. When you're in there, in the classroom, in the B'nai Mitzvah study session, wherever it is that you are, in the home, right? In the math class, you're dealing with a kid, you're not dealing with a diagnosis, but services is a big piece of this. And so we see it does affect that. Okay, just quickly about language. This is a concern that comes up for people a lot. How do we talk about it? And I just want to sort of say up front, it's impossible to always say the right thing. It's also impossible to always be politically correct. There are lots of different views on the right and the wrong way to say things. Within this community, one of the biggest ongoing debates is this person first versus identity first language. I'm not sure how many, have people heard of these two things before? No? Okay. So briefly, person first language, it's basically this. It's whether you call somebody a person with autism or an autistic person. Person first language is putting their personhood first, right? It's a person with autism. It's a person who uses a wheelchair. It's a kid with ADHD, right? Versus an autistic person, a disabled person, etc. Those are the two. And you get people on both sides. Special educators, in general, people like me, often bang the drum for person first very hard, right? And like that we got to look at the person before we look at the disability. In the autism community, it's a little bit different, right? Some disability communities, they feel the same way, where like, look beyond my disability and I'm a person first who has a disability that you also have to address. In the autistic community, we're increasingly seeing people wanting you to use their identity first. Say, I'm an autistic person. Or people used to call themselves Aspies, right? Short for Asperger's, right? And the reason for that is because autism is central to who I am as a human being. And if you ignore it, you're ignoring me as a person. And you're also then not, if you can't say it, as Dumbledore says, refusal to use a name increases the fear of it, right? If you can't say it, you can't think about accessibility. And so in the autism community, among self-advocates, you see this big push towards using the identity first. In other parts of the disability community, it's the other way around. And so, basically the bottom line is the most important thing, whoever you're talking to, is to be respectful and genuine, right? How you say it is less important, or you could ask people what they would prefer, right? But that's just something to put out there because it comes up a lot. And it is a little bit different for autism than some of these other disabilities we'll be talking about. Any questions about any of that? Yes, Rebecca.
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I guess my question is, how often is it important to use the label? Like, can't we just talk? I mean, so many people have different needs and different learning styles and different ways that they respond better in the classroom. Is it even useful to say that this person, it's a person with autism, or they're an autistic person, or is it just another person that we need to differentiate our learning for?
So that's a great question. That's a great question. It depends on the setting, right? It's not okay to use that without permission, right? You can't like out somebody, right? Like you can't call a kid in the class, this kid has autism, unless that kid has been really open about it, But it's an interesting thought. I mean, for me, I kind of think, assuming that everybody is okay with it being used, I think it's actually helpful to lift it up, because it goes to, while also not using it to single anybody out in a negative way. Right. And it's not because, oh, this kid is autistic, he needs all this help. More like, hey, this is really cool. We have all these different, it's kind of like the quote in the beginning, how it's great that we're all different. And, I talk about like flowers a lot. The world would be a very boring place if we only had one kind of flower, right? Part of what makes our world really amazing and beautiful is that we have so many varieties of that. And there is a little bit of, if you can't talk about it, you can't really address it. People used to be this way about race. It's thankfully, at least here, it's getting less like that, where people would say, oh, I don't see color. I don't think about color. And we'll pretend it doesn't exist. And it's tough because like it does exist. And it's very obvious, and that's something that the lack of talking about it is what has led to a lot of the problems that we've had. It's much more useful to say, look at all of us in the class and we all have different colors of skin. That's awesome. Mine is a little bit lighter than yours. Yours is a little bit darker than mine. That's so cool. And it goes a little bit towards that. It's not that different from the other thing you're saying, Rebecca, which is like, everybody in this class is working on something, right? Everybody has needs, right? What you're working on is learning how to ask a friend to play. What she's working on is how to read Hebrew, right? Whatever it might be. And we all have stuff we're working on, and it's not any different. This person needs to fidget because that's what helps them to focus, right? You might need to doodle because that's what helps you focus, right? You might need to get up and walk around. So the label is less important than the lifting up of the difference. It's more just if you're talking about it, like out in the world or in a professional setting or something like that, these questions can come up. Or even if a parent is telling you about it, you refer to their kid as
Sure.
So but yeah, I mean, I think yes, you're right that like at the end of the day, we're all kids who need different kinds of support, and the important thing is lifting up the difference. The label is less important.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Good. All right. So moving on quickly, intervention and approaches. So behavior, there are two main kinds that I think about that we hear about most are behavioral and play-based. So the principles of behavioral stuff and applied behavioral analysis, or ABA is the one you might hear about most often, are a couple things. You break down tasks into small parts or steps, right? So a complex task like, I don't know, washing your hands, right? You do this in preschool a lot, right? Go to the sink, turn on the water, get your hands wet, put on soap, rub for 15 seconds, rinse it off, turn off the water, dry off your hands, right? Go back to class, right? Whatever it might be. But so something like that, breaking those down into really small parts that you can then reinforce along the way. So with behavioral approaches, you're really trying to encourage kids through some kind of a tangible reinforcer. It could be praise. It could be like a thing they like. If you're doing an ABA session, which none of you will be, but some of your kids might have them, it could actually be giving them something to play with when they do the thing they're supposed to do, right? And you're working on it in a way that's really behavioral, really just designed to reward what you want to see more of, right? If it's done poorly, it can kind of look like dog training and not be very fun for the kid. If it's done well, it can be pretty effective. You also, in behavioral approaches, you take data to show improvement, right? There's a lot of data that's needed to show that this kid is now doing this thing 8 out of 10 times instead of 2 out of 10 times, which is what he did in the beginning, right? So that's how when you're thinking about things behaviorally, it's about what do we reinforce, how do we reinforce it, and how do we track change, right? In a kind of very clear, logical way. What's great about it is that it makes showing progress easier, right? It's easy to measure. Therefore, it's easy to show evidence that it works. Therefore, it's easy to call it evidence-based. Therefore, kids get access to behavioral services almost immediately upon diagnosis, right? However, it misses a lot, right? It can turn into rote learning. It can turn into situations like the kid I used to work with that says the same thing in the same way every time, right? And it can turn into kids who seem like little robots, right? If it's done poorly. So what kind of comes in on the out to sort of, complement that are these more play-based principles. The one that I'm the biggest fan of is DIR, or floor time. How many people here have heard of that before? Some of us. Okay. Yep. So it's basically a play-based way of working with kids. DIR stands for developmental because it's about where the kid is in their developmental stage overall and today. Where are they in their development? What are they like today? It's individually based. That's the I. So it's not the same thing to everybody. You're not doing the same kinds of drills for every kid as you would if you're doing behavioral stuff. It's really about what is that kid like? What does that kid respond to? And the R is relationship based. And that's really the key. It's about the relationship between the kid and the teacher, the kid and the rabbi, the kid and the cantor, the kid and whomever, right? It's all of those. So it's really about how do we kind of increase that relationship. So the things that we do when we're doing play-based stuff is we follow the child's lead, right? We see what they're interested in and we go with that. Behavioral, we come in with an idea of what it is that we want to teach, how we want them to work on it, and we do it, right? Now you may, in reading this, feel yourself more aligned with one way of working or the other, right? There's room for both of these things. I used to think when I was younger, when I first started out, that behavioral was the only way to go, because that's what I first learned. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. Then I realized later that it missed a lot. And then I went the whole other way, which was that behavioral approaches are awful. Everything should be play-based all the time, right? It's horrible. Kids don't learn anything. It's useless, right? And then, as happens with maturity and perspective, you start to realize that actually they're both really great. And what's most important is you pull what's going to work for that kid, right? So you can use principles of both when you're working with a particular child. Following the child's lead. This comes up a lot. It's really easy to do in preschool. It gets a little bit, especially play-based preschools like those of you who are here are from. It gets a little bit harder as kids get older, but for me, it just changes. Rather than getting down on the floor and pushing a train around with a kid, you're talking with them about magic. The magic cards, or you're talking with them back when Pokemon Go was the thing. You're talking with them about Pokemon, Go and joining them in that. You're joining them in their interest in video games or books or movies or sports or whatever it might be. So you're still following their lead. You're just doing it in a different way by finding what the commonalities are and connecting. You then want to expand from within without taking control. So once you join, you're trying to kind of help push things along, right? An example that I always think about is a kid that I used to know who would flap his hands and jump up and down. A behavioral person might say, that's a behavior that we need to stop. It looks weird. The parents don't like it, and it's keeping him from learning, right? Or her from learning, right? So we need to stop it. A play-based person might say, actually, I don't think that, which is totally valid, maybe, right? For my money, I'd rather not stop it. I'd rather use it. Right. So for me, I would join the kids. So what I did with any number of kids over the years, kids who would jump and flap, get over, start jumping and flapping with them and turning it into flying. Oh, you want to fly? Great, let's fly. Whee, we're going to fly. And you fly them across the room and you put them down and you tickle them and you run the other way. Right. And then they come over to you and they look at you and they do it again, jumping up and down, but looking at you this time because they want you to do it again. Right. And so then it turns into flying and it transforms from this very solitary jumping and flapping where I'm getting my own sensory needs met, but I'm not really engaging with other people so much. It lets them continue to get those needs met while also engaging, and it kind of transforms it. So that's an expanding. I'm not trying to stop it. I'm just shaping it a little bit. And if the kid didn't like flying, I would turn it to something else. I don't know, splashing water, whatever it might be. So it's about expanding from within without taking control, and really, above all else, relating to the child with warmth and intimacy, right? Really getting in on their level and connecting, right? In a good way. I've heard kind of early DIR floor time stuff being described as falling in love with each other, right? Where you are really, creating a really nice warm relationship. And I think that happens in classrooms, right? Like at preschool, you have them for a few years. Over the religious school years, you're seeing them grow and you have the ability to work with them. And then when they get to the mitzvah age and you're working with them, you're seeing them every week or every other week or whatever it is. You have a real opportunity to build a relationship there. To kind of kind of help from within. Okay.
David, this is Leora. I have a
Oh, Leora.
question. About the example that you gave about flapping, how does the DIR approach kind of acknowledge that it's like a self-stimulation that may be coming from like a neurological place, and that it might just be kind of confusing to merge it with like an imaginative thing, like I'm a bird? So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I think, you know, it definitely is very conscious of, the DIR model is very aware of the fact that it's a sensory thing, right? The main difference really is that we don't look at it as, if you're doing that model, you don't look at it as a thing to be stopped, but you look at it as a springboard to other things. So getting that same kind of, you can still let them do that, you know, and get that kind of, you know, sensory input. And if the flying thing doesn't work, you know, then it's okay to just let it be, you know? I mean, I think one of the things about DIR is that it's really about following the child's lead. And if something doesn't work, you drop it, right? If this kid just really needs to do that for a few minutes, then that's fine, right? And we let them do that. I think it comes up in classrooms a lot because it takes them away from learning, right? And then and sometimes it can be distracting for other kids. And so part of it is raising the awareness in the classroom that this is just what they do to stay calm, the same way that you doodle or use a fidget or tap your foot or chew your pen or whatever it is, right? And it's not a thing you have to look out for, and that it's okay, you know, for them to go and do that. I think we want to look for opportunities to find those moments of connection, right? Because that's what's missing, is that ability to connect with other humans. And that's one of the things that people with autism tend to, you know, struggle with a little bit, is how do we connect? How do we have a friendship? And we want to sort of, even though they want it. So that's part of why I say to use it and not stop it, because then you can still give them that, you know, that experience while also simultaneously making it something relational. It doesn't even have to be like a pretend thing. I mean, it could just be like me and the kid, or you and the kid flapping back and forth for 10 minutes, you know, where you're looking at each other and taking turns, right? It doesn't have to be a pretend thing. You know, and even if they're not aware of it being a bird or whatever it is, that's less important than, you know, if it's creating closeness, right? We go back to this warmth and intimacy thing. If it's bringing you closer together, then it's a great thing to do. And if they don't get that it's a pretend thing, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that now we're flapping together and we're doing something fun. And when I cross the room afterwards, you run over to me and ask me to do it again, right? Which helps people to learn I have to do something to get something, right? Which goes back to communication, goes back to socialization. If I want something, I have to do something, right? When I ask, then I receive, right? And that's the thing that we try to teach some of our kids, right? We teach all kids, like, I mean, we're saying kids all the time, use your words, ask for what you want, you know? I mean, I said it to my daughter, my 5.5-year-old, like 3 times this morning, you know, tell me what you want. Don't grunt, tell me what you want, you know? And so I think that, you know, that creating that dynamic where there's, I do something, you do something, I do something, you do something, can be the key to unlocking more complex social interaction down the line. Does that make sense? Leora?
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. So some tools and strategies that we use, behavioral, and we're not going to go into this too much. I'll show you a picture. ABC charts, some of you have seen them before with me. It's just a way of tracking behavior. I'm going to show you one in a minute. Antecedent is what happens right before a behavior. B is the behavior, and C is the consequence, like what happened right afterwards. Not consequence like punishment, consequence like what happened afterwards. That's a tool that gets used a lot. Token economies, we may have heard of this. This is where kids, you know, when they do those kind of desired behaviors, they get a thing that at some point they can cash in for something they want. I was in a religious school classroom once where they would put little pennies or something in like or it was mahjong tiles. That's what it was. Mahjong tiles in like a jar at their desk. And when they filled up their jar, they like got a sticker, you know? And that's a token economy. It's basically working towards something and getting that reinforcement of the actual little thing into your box or whatever. And you can do that in conjunction with the home as well. They can work if they're behaving in a certain way or doing the things that they need to do while they're with you, then that translates into some privilege or something at home, right? That's a good way to do it. If you're gonna do it that way. Play-based, joining then expanding. That's kind of the flapping example, right? Joining in and then taking it outwards. Treating actions as intentional, right? That's another big thing when it comes to play-based stuff. When a kid is flapping or whatever, you respond as if they're doing it on purpose to get you to interact with them, right? Even if they're not, right? Because that may unlock something that's relationship. And if you're trying and it's not working, then you stop trying. You don't have to like bang your head against the wall, right? Or make the kid do something they don't want to do. That's not what it's about. But a way in is responding as if everything is intentional, even if you're not sure that really it is. Going for the gleam in the eye, right? That's going for that moment where they're really excited, where you've got them, where you can see it in their eyes, right? And that can happen sometimes even when they're learning something for their bar bat mitzvah, right? That gleam in the eye when they get it, and this trope that was eluding them, suddenly they got it. Or, I used to not be able to get through the first line of my Haftorah. Now I know half of it cold. You get excited. So that you're going for that. Scaffolding is, basically giving support to kids to sort of help them, do the things they couldn't do on their own, like scaffolding for a building, right? Scaffolding for a building is there, so the painter, the window washer, the construction worker, whatever, can get up higher than they could on their own to do whatever needs doing, right? Wash the windows, paint the roof, whatever, and then when the job is done, the scaffolding goes away, right? Same thing, but it's about scaffolding for kids and social interactions. So helping them to see social openings, bringing them to other kids, bringing other kids to them, helping find commonalities, things like that, and then stepping back when you're no longer needed. Okay, here's an example of an ABC chart. I'm hoping you can see it, but there's date, time, activity, what was happening in the moment, what happened right before the behavior that might have triggered it. This person hit them. I said no, whatever it might be. Behavior, what it looked like, and what happened after the behavior as a result of the behavior. So this is just a way to track, right, what's going on and figure out where you can help. These are examples of token economies. They can also be as simple as a jar, like I said, with Mahjong tiles. But I'm working for, and that's a Velcro square where you would put a little picture of whatever it is they're working for. And this one is with pennies, and they get 5 pennies, and then they get the thing. All right,
David?
Yeah.
Going back to the last screen for one quick second, for the consequence, is the consequence what naturally happened because of the behavior, or what happened to them because of the behavior? What happened from the adult because of the behavior?
The former. So okay. What actually happened as a result? So the result was, and it could also include what the adult did, right? But the result could be, say it's, I said no, you can't play with that right now. Is the antecedents. The behavior is the kid started to hit me, right? And the consequence was the child had to be, the child had to be removed from the room, and we had to talk, right? Or it could be as simple as, like, if it's with another kid, the child pinched the other kid and the other kid walked away. That's the consequence, right?
And then the information that we're gleaning on the chart, is that then useful to the adults in the child's life or also to the child?
It could be both. For a younger kid, it's mostly going to be useful for the adult. If the kid is old enough to be self-reflective and notice the patterns and talk about them, then it's good for them too, right? Okay. It's really about noticing patterns and figuring out where you might intervene. Okay,
great. Thank you.
Sure. So there's token economies. You can see the one on the one on the right is more of like a game board. I'm working for free time, and you get stars to fill up the game board, and then you're there. There's like a million ways of doing it. If you Google token economy images, you'll find 1,000 of them. But I just put them there to give you a couple of examples. Other strategies with autism. So a lot of times we see in autism, kids have special interests or fixations, things they really are into and want to talk about or do a lot. And we like to use it in our teaching as much as possible. If a kid is really into trains, is there a way to incorporate trains into the lesson? Are the letters in whatever Hebrew word they're working on, could you draw them as a train, right? Is there a train track that gets you to the end of the blessing? Is there, whatever, right? You figure out ways of kind of using those interests in your teaching, and then you get in. The technical word for those special interests and fixations is perseveration. You might hear that. A kid perseverates on this, that, or the other thing, meaning they just are talking about that and want to do that all the time. And if we can find ways of using it, it really goes a long way towards letting us in. So also with autism and the language communication challenge that we talked about earlier, there can be processing delays, right? It can take a longer time than typical to process language. You ask a question and it takes time to figure out what you said, what does it mean, formulate an answer, get the words to your mouth and get them out, right? So allowing enough time for someone to respond to a question and not rushing to call on somebody else goes a long way towards helping with that. giving time. Silence, educators are really uncomfortable with silence. Try it sometime, ask a question, and wait like 10 seconds if nobody answers, and see what happens. See how uncomfortable you feel, right? Those 10 seconds feel like an eternity, right? It happens on these webinars sometimes when I'm not face-to-face with everybody. If there's a long silence, I'm like, is it okay? Is it okay? Right? We don't know, we're uncomfortable with that. But if you can get yourself to wait even a few extra seconds for your kids with autism or sensory or auditory processing, you're going to help them a lot. Remembering that with autism, there's no such thing as common sense. So what I mean by that is in terms of social interaction, you and I know that we don't walk up to somebody and put our faces in their face and go, hi, how you doing? Good morning, right? It can be a little bit intense, right? We don't do that mostly, right? Some of our little children don't realize that you're not supposed to do that. But some of our older children with autism also don't realize that you're not supposed to do that, that there's such a thing as being too close, right? So it's things like that. Sometimes you need a little bit more explicit instruction about how to go about these social things. Find ways of connecting with the students. Could be an interest, a book, a movie, so on, and use them often. If you have Madrahim or aides, those are teen aides for those of you that are not in religious school settings. Teens are really great at connecting this way. They're a lot closer to the peer culture than we as adults are, maybe more interested in the same things. But you can find those ways. It goes a long way, and helping them to find those connections with other kids, right? Oh, you really are into Legos. So is Johnny. Maybe you'd like to build Legos together. Oh, Sarah, I know that you are really super into unicorns right now. So is Matthew. Matthew and Sarah, why don't you want to build a unicorn together, right? Like you can find those connections and do some of that work for them. And then if you can work one-on-one with the students, that's always helpful. It's harder in a classroom situation, but if you have another team who can do that, or you yourself can do that, that's great. Okay, any questions about any of that before we move on to the scenario part? Okay. So I want to do one quickly all together. It's kind of long. So we'll just do a brief discussion of this, and then we'll break you up, and I'll give you one more, okay, to look at for a few minutes. We have about 15 minutes left, actually a little more than that, 17 minutes. So I think we'll be good. Would anybody like to read this for us? This is a made-up kid named Jake.
I'll read it.
All right, Kara.
Jake is 6 years old. He's very intelligent and very verbal. Socially, though, he struggles. He prefers to spend his time alone, cutting out and pasting letters or sifting sand with his fingers. He can get overwhelmed when there is a lot of sensory input and is very impulsive when he gets excited, hitting kids, pinching, and so on. He does not spontaneously seek to share enjoyment and interest with others, usually staying by himself. He occasionally watches other children play with interest, but usually does not join. However, when other students are prompted to ask him to join and play, he is interested and he will often say yes.
Great. Sound like any kids you know? Yeah, okay. So this actually is based off a kid that I worked with a billion years ago, but it's very, this kind of pattern is really common, right? So here are the questions, and when we break up into our groups, it'll be the same questions. So we're just gonna talk about these quickly as a group, just to get our feet wet a little bit. So anybody, what stands out to you most about Jake's challenges, or otherwise known as, what would you most like to work on with him? What's the thing that worries you the most in what Kara just read, or not worries you, but you'd want to address?
Entering play.
Okay.
I would say keeping everybody physically safe.
Okay, because of the pinching and hitting.
Yeah.
Okay, two great ones. And actually, those two things are related. Sometimes kids enter play by hitting or pinching, right? I've seen that, and I see that a lot.
Or other kids avoid him because he hits and pinches.
Yes.
So.
And when he's getting pinched, then kids are less likely to come up to you, and they decide to be your friend. And then it's a cycle again, where like the kid doesn't know how to make friends. The kid, they're hitting and pinching, and no one likes that, and they don't want to be around them, and the kid doesn't learn how to make friends, right? And feels sad, and that's a bad situation. Okay, good. So those are two great things. So let's start with those two, because those are two things that stick out to me too. So it could be either Rachel or Rebecca or anybody else. If you're going to work with Jake on one of those two things, how would you attempt to help him, and why? What would you do, and why would you do it?
Can you go back to the other screen while we are thinking? Thanks.
And I may not see your hand, so call out.
I mean, for me, like, I feel like I would try to play with Jake, doing whatever Jake likes. So cutting out and pasting letters and sifting sand through his fingers. And then potentially, like after playing with Jake one-on-one, try to encourage other friends to enter the play and also like model the language of like how you would ask a child to come and play. Or same thing, like playing with Jake and then trying to seeing that he stares at other kids play. So seeing that he's interested in like a certain play that kids are playing in, and then trying to show him how you can enter play, like what question would you ask? Like, what are you playing? And things like that. That's maybe where I would.
Great. And what made you, why would you take that route? Like why do you think that's the way to go? I agree with you. Why do you think that, why would you choose that?
Well, I mean, he has a lot of language and like he's very aware. He's just struggles with communication with like his peers. And he shows interest in their play, so it's not like he's not interested. And I also think like modeling is one of the best forms of teaching, especially when it comes to communication. So that's why I would go that route. And then also you're bonding with Jake on your own as a teacher as well. So that's also
good. Excellent. Anybody else want to answer that second question?
I would think about maybe having him work with like a small group, because sometimes, especially with the kids that I've worked with, it can be overwhelming to be in a class full of 20 kids. So if you can maybe take a walk to a garden with just maybe two or three kids, and then you have that kind of more intimate setting where you can really model that and maybe have the child feel less anxious, so they're able to engage and kind of process what's happening more easily. So that's maybe something that I would do with him, to break up into small groups.
Great. Excellent. Two good answers. And question number 3, how would you know if you were successful? What would you see that would be different, that would say, oh, it worked? Could be either you that answered already or somebody else.
I mean, if Jake started, or like if you were facilitating play with Jake and some other peers, and then they actually started like having cooperative play where you could kind of step back a little bit and not have to really facilitate, that would be obviously great.
Wonderful. Anybody else?
I think also if you notice that Jake's not being physically aggressive with anyone else, you can see kind of a successful relationship there.
Yep. Good. He's figured out other strategies, right? Figured out something else he can do. Perfect. Excellent. Good. So this is the kind of conversation you're going to have in your groups in just a minute. So I'm going to split you up now into breakout groups. I don't know if you have been on these before, but it's a pretty funky thing. On Zoom, you have these breakout rooms, and you kind of feel, for me, it always reminds me of like, this is my second Harry Potter reference today. It always reminds me of like the Portkey, you know, where like you're here and then suddenly you just like get whisked off to like another room. So I have put you into groups. I am going to stop sharing my screen. So I sort of put you into groups based on kind of like roughly the population that you work with. So we have 3 groups, and there are going to be 3 different scenarios. I'm going to put into the chat box a link to a Google Doc, which is going to have 3 scenarios. One for early childhood, preschool, one for early elementary school, and one for middle elementary school. I didn't do anything in middle school because we all work with lots of different types of kids, and middle elementary will get you close enough. You can think about yerba mate mitzvah kids too, even though it's middle elementary. The specifics of the grade don't matter as much. But so I divide you into groups. The ECE group, and each group will have 4 people in it. So the ECE group is going to be those of you that are or very recently worked in preschools. So Christine and Bob, Kara and Iris. Then the early elementary group is going to be Jacqueline, Leora, Rachel, and Elise. And the middle elementary are our synagogue staff folks. So it's going to be Barbara, Rebecca, Harriet, and Rabbi Chaim. So if you click on that link that I put in the chat box, you should see a Google Doc that has, 3 scenarios. I adapted them from a book called Engaging Autism. And there are 3 questions. It's the same ones we just answered. And you can actually type into this document. So as you have your conversation, feel free to put, and I see a lot of you are signed on to it, so it seems like it's working. Feel free to kind of put your comments literally in the document so we can, we'll be able to see it when we come back. So if you're in that first group, Christine, Bob, Karen, Iris, you're going to obviously look at the ECE one. That middle group, Jacqueline, Leora, Rachel, and Elise, look at the second scenario, that's early elementary. And then our synagogue folks will look at the middle elementary. And you're going to answer those same 3 questions. I'll give you about 5 minutes or so to do just what we just did, right? And then we'll come back and we'll kind of briefly share with each other, and then we'll wrap up and say goodbye. Okay?
I'm not seeing anything that you talked about.
Okay,
on
did
my-
you see do you see a little orange chat window?
No.
Okay.
My chat window is white.
Yours was white? Okay.
Well, there's a chat at the bottom of the screen. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You click on it?
Got it. Now I
You
see
see the link now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And other people in your group will have the link too. Anybody else having technical issues
Not
finding
seeing
the
anything, but anyway, I'll let other people do that.
Sorry, what'd you say?
I'm not, there's a link from David Neufeld to everyone.
Yeah.
Looking at?
Click on it.
That's fine.
Yeah, I'm just not getting anything from it.
When you click on it, nothing happens?
Yes.
Can you copy and paste it into a web browser?
Copy and paste it into your browser then.
Or I'll read it to you, Barbara.
Anyway, if I'm in a group with others, they'll help me.
It'll be fine. All right, ready? I'm going to send you off. Ready?
I have a question.
Oh, yep.
Want us to write in there or just discuss?
Up to you. If you want to write, that's great. That way, you can just make a couple of notes, and then we'll have it as a document that everybody can see later. If it makes more sense for you just to talk about it, especially because we only have a few minutes, that's also fine. Whatever works best. Okay? Up to the group. All right, I'm going to send you all there. Ready, set, port key.
Join breakout room.
Yeah, say yes. If it says join breakout room, say yes.
I don't know. Expanding. Is that a challenge?
Christine and Bob, you see it?
Yeah.
So click on yes.
Oh, click. There's yes.
Or join or whatever it says.
Oh, wait, well, I thought you were asking if we see the scenario. Okay, there it is. Join.
Strong and he has a good vocabulary, but he has difficulty keeping up with the rest of the class in terms of higher levels of thinking, such as planning how he is going to go about completing an assignment or achieving a physical task. It is especially difficult for Danny to deal with situations in which there is more than one possible course of action or more than one interpretation of an event. For example, figuring out what to do with a box of Legos or how to react when a friend doesn't want to hang out with him on the playground. All right, what stands out to you most about Alyssa's challenge? Danny's challenges. Or what would you most like to work with him on?
So we all work in supplemental schools, right?
Yes, I think so.
You do. I am here too. I'm popping it on everybody. Yes.
Usually with 4th, 5th, and 6th grade.
Right. So, I mean, the only thing that I was thinking about was that I'm not going to solve all of the problems of a child in the 4, 5, 6 hours a week that I get with them. So for me, I usually try to focus on how to make their experience here as meaningful as possible, and what does that look like in their interactions with their peers, with their classmates, with their teachers, and how can we make it as positive of an experience as well as most engaging with them, I guess. So, I'm less concerned about him like knowing what
so that, because for her it might make sense that she's coming in right in the middle and everybody knows exactly where she is, but to recognize that she needs to introduce that.
Folks, just popping in to see how it's going.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we're heading towards question number 2.
Great. A couple more minutes and then we'll come all back together.
Cool.
So
there was like a X on the wall, and there was a line, and children stayed out of that area, and it wasn't just for a specific child. It was like any children could do it, and they would take turns, and we would have a waiting list, and and it really worked out nicely with that.
Yeah.
It does say that he does it for hours, so I'm wondering if it's not just like a temporary need to settle down, but if there's but I think it's a very good question. It's a very good place to start to try and understand why is he doing it and what's he getting out of it.
If the environment is very stimulating, like a play base when you have lots of noise and everybody's kind of all moving around, maybe that child will benefit more from a more structured environment.
Welcome back, Leora.
You might need to go find them.
They'll automatically come back.
Okay.
If they don't come back themselves, they'll automatically get zoomed back here.
Okay. I wrote some of our notes on the document.
Great. How you doing? You all right?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, bad spelling. There we go.
Very good.
All right, here everyone's back. All right, welcome back, folks. Okay, so we're almost at the end here. Obviously, I can stay a couple minutes more for anybody that would like and answer questions and things like that. But for now, anybody before we all take off, anybody want to share what they talked about in their group?
I'm happy to share.
Great.
I think what we talked about was the importance of the function of the behavior, kind of talking in about the ABCs, because what we found concerning about his behavior was the repetition of what he was doing with the trains and trying to figure out what's happening in that moment. Is it self-stimulatory behavior? Like, what is he getting from it? And then once you kind of figure out that piece, then you can take the steps to actually help him kind of expand his play, or maybe put him in a classroom that has a smaller amount of kids, or bring down the noise level. So that's what we
Great.
talked about.
So for those of you that didn't look, the ECE scenario was about a kid who likes to line up cars all the time, and it's kind of hard to get in. And if you try to move things too fast, he gets really frustrated really quickly. Great. Excellent. Somebody from group 2 or 3?
I was in group 3, I think, the older kids. We got a little stumped, actually.
Okay.
Rebecca suggested that his issue might be the social, being able to form bonds with his peers.
Mm-hmm.
I know as I was reading it, I sort of felt like, I don't really know what's the appropriate toolkit. That's something that got me stuck on. Okay. I couldn't participate very well in that group, I felt. So sorry, guys.
It's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something here where he's having a hard time with choice, right? In this one, it's hard for this kid to deal with situations where there's more than one way to go, more than one interpretation of an event. Like if a friend doesn't want to hang out with him on the playground, he might jump to, oh, they don't like me, they don't want to be my friend anymore. And it might be a moment to kind of take the pulse of what's actually going on here, right? And kind of see, well, you have a box of Legos, there's lots of ways you can go. And sometimes kids with autism get a little stuck, right? Because there's this sort of like real need to know what's coming. And so it's, the way that I would probably go about it is to, maybe with this kid who is verbal, et cetera, talk about, well, are there times that you would rather not play? And what's going on for you then? Does it mean you don't like the person, right? Same kind of conversation that you might have with a preschooler, but on a more older kid level. And to sort of help scaffold the, what do I do with a big box of Legos when I could do anything, or I don't know what to do during free time because there's too many choices. You might do something like give him a list of things he could choose from, things like that. So those are things I might have thought of. But yeah, these things I only gave you like 5 minutes, so it's hard to come up with great solutions in 5 minutes. Okay, anybody else from group number 2?
Ours was about a girl who had sensitivity to touch, but not so much sound, and that she also would get very anxious very easily, and that would lead to in the thing it was annoying behaviors, so that her peers would get annoyed with her behaviors. So we sort of talked about one addressing the actual environment, changes that you can make in the environment to help her with her stimulation, but then also figuring out how to address her anxiety, so that maybe that would help to diminish the behaviors.
Great. Good. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, so these are all great things. I think we, as we see, autism, there's a lot there, right? And, certainly if any of you want to talk more about, particular kids, things like that, that's a thing that I'm available for you for. You feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to share my screen just one last time before I let you all go, so you can see my contact information. You have it anyway because I've been emailing you, but that's my contact info, my email, and my phone number, and I will send out an email to this whole group with the slides. I also did put into the chat box a link to a survey, an evaluation that would be great for you to fill out. I'll put that link again in the email that I'll send out later today or maybe tomorrow, but we do love that feedback. And I just like to leave folks with this quote: educate a child according to their way. Also, when they grow, they will not stray from it. Because for me, that's what this all comes down to, right? We got to figure out what works for these kids and give them the great experiences, and help them to learn and normalize. So I do know that we are at 3:34. So if anybody needs to jump off, thank you for coming, for being a part of this. I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you at the other sessions. Anybody that wants to stay, if you have questions, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes. Other than that, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.